This is a loosely coupled show with James Hickey and Comartin. If you're new to this channel, we chat about software architecture and design. Make sure to subscribe to get all our latest episodes. If you have a suggestion for a topic or a guest, make sure to let us know in the comments.
I'm going to say I suspect, but I don't want to say I know because I don't know in the conclusive way, but I highly suspect that most organizations really fail in this area, the specifications and requirements. And looking back to my own experience, the first company I worked for, well, the first two companies, the second company I worked for actually acquired the first one I worked for, so it was kind of like a seamless thing. But I did do some transitions as far as what I worked on. So in that case, I was working on this platform for automotive manufacturers to deal with like their finances. So if you owned like a Kia dealership and you also owned another kind, like a Toyota dealership, you'd have to deal with the finances differently. So this just helped you to like upload your finances to the head office and then they could do analysis on it, blah, 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 stuff like that. So we had a development team, probably about 20 developers, maybe a bit less, a bit more, depending on when it was. But yeah, but we had like accountants on our team, like actual accountants who had experience in like automotive finances, people who had worked for like Mitsubishi, Mercedes-Benz, and these kinds of companies. There was one person in particular too who was like, I'd say like the expert. She had worked for like multiple manufacturers. She was definitely like the subject matter expert. So that was it. It wasn't like a domain-driven kind of thing. It wasn't a very collaborative kind of thing. Putting that aside, it was still driven by these people who are actually had like industry knowledge and had been in the industry. So the requirements that the developers would get, I mean, it's still, as a developer, you would get, here's what you need to build, here are the things that it needs to do. Still a lot of ambiguity in terms of, or leeway in terms of how you can do that, but definitely the core pieces of what you had to do was well done. Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of room for improvement, but yeah, I mean, it was well done. And then after that, I worked for a project for an insurance company, and same thing. Like as a developer, you get these requirements, and there's some leeway. Usually, like I would say, usually in terms of like UX and UI. And no guidance as far as like how you're going to code this thing, but from like a business perspective, at least the requirements were done by like people who actually were in the field, experts in that domain. So yeah, I mean, when I think of like the requirements that we got for that project, they were very well done. Where I'm working now, there's literally no specs, no requirements. We get like like, here's a diagram of the UI, and now you have to build it. And so a lot of what I've been trying to do is incorporate domain-driven kinds of things like event storming and collaboration, these kinds of things. And it's been getting better. There's still a lot of room for improvement, for sure, like we had talked about the last session. But yeah, I mean, that's just to lay out my experience. I've seen good, I've seen bad, and I'm sure there's even like way better that maybe you've experienced. What I like to do, maybe I'll just throw it out, is where I am now, what I like to do is comes back to architecture, especially using CQRS, where you can divide things in terms of queries and commands. Once there's kind of an understanding of how, let's say, a feature or a product or whatever is going to work, and this comes back to event storming. You can do this with event storming, plot out all your events, and then typically each event will have a command associated to it. and probably each view model or UI piece will have a query attached to it, at least to start off. And yeah, I literally just like to list off, like, here are all the kinds of things that users can interact with. And I like to think of them as like either commands or queries, but kind of at the higher level of, as a user, I can do these things. So literally just list them off. And I think once you do that, I like to basically translate them into like actual, not translate it into code, but start digging into those individual use cases more of like, here's the kind of thing that this command needs to do. It needs to interact with this, and maybe we can use this approach or this technique or pattern or whatever. And even sometimes I'll code up like a quick, like, oh, maybe this piece should be a value object and this piece should be an entity, and I'll actually just code up like a quick sketch of that and screenshot that and pop it in for people to see when they're actually like going to that piece. That seemed to work well, especially when you have people coming into the project later. You can kind of say like, okay, here's what we've done, here's the next piece that we need to do, and you can link those to like if you have like wireframes or whatever, you can even link specific use cases to a specific screen or whatever. I mean, it's still not ideal, but it's given kind of where the company's at, that seems to work well. I think the next step is just to do that at the higher level, like interact with whoever's actually planning these features or whatever. But yeah, I mean, that works well for me where I am. But again, yeah, it definitely exposes issues. I think just the more you can write things down and try to figure out, okay, if this happens and this happens, well, what about this scenario here? Like, oh, this actually, there's an issue with this scenario. We got to deal with it. As opposed to like, we've coded everything and we discover this big issue and it's kind of late to discover that.
Yeah, I think what you're alluding to at the end there is, I'm trying to think back at like different projects that I've worked on, and they've all been very different in terms of how they worked. But I feel like I'm just winging this right now. This isn't a digested thought. I'm just coming up with it right now. I feel like most people that I've talked to in the business, or like for the application that we're writing that are involved in it, generally do think about events. They do think about workflow.
Mm-hmm.
That's generally actually how they think about it. And I feel like my past self years ago would have ignored that or not even seen it, because I was too much into just a general basic CRUD approach. That's not to say that users themselves that you're talking to, like if you're just getting a screenshot of a UI and they're like, add this box, right? Like I want to enter it. That's not to say that they won't do that. Because I think there's probably a situation where both occur. But when I think back about some of the real stuff like that I've worked on, even the apps that maybe weren't using an event-driven approach or CQRS or any of that stuff, when I think about what the app did and how I would talk to those people and like the situations we would talk about, everything was always about a workflow and events. Mm-hmm. So it's just that the app didn't capture that, how it was written.
Yeah.
Right. And so
it's a very like implicit thing. So you manually have to kind of connect the dots as opposed to making that connection like an explicit thing that happens.
Yeah, it's kind of shocking to me now that I think about this. You think like, oh, it's like just all these, which I suspect in a lot of cases is a lot of CRUD being developed, and I think I think that is very applicable in certain situations, parts of apps, right? I think like that's for sure is applicable for a lot of setup data and stuff potentially.
Yeah.
There's a lot of workflow involved in, and I think about how modeling that and those state transitions via kind of especially when you're talking to users about UI and it being task driven, I wonder if it hasn't been developers themselves causing the issue of CRUD and going down a CRUD way rather than, for some reason, I always had this notion that it was users forcing developers down this road of CRUD. But the more I'm thinking about it right now, I'm like, I don't know, because everybody I've really ever talked to hasn't ever really worked in that, like from a business side, from a user side, hasn't really ever thought that way. That I think about it. So this is like a self-inflicted wound when we go down this path of, because I think about, I've said this a million times on Twitter, which is, and it bothers the hell out of me, but it's a reality, is the vast majority of tutorials or 101 entry-level coding stuff that you see regarding anything is CRUD.
Yeah.
The problem with that is, and the reason it's that way, and I'm guilty of it too, is because you're not about to create some elaborate example to show some basic concept. But when you do that, you make kind of decisions that you're aware of, thinking, I wouldn't really do it this way if this were a piece to a larger puzzle, but this is a demo application, so I don't need to do this. That's kind of over the top.
Yeah.
Right, because it's like a 3 API endpoint, like you know what I mean, just doesn't need all this stuff that I would normally have potentially. But then those examples get used and then they turn into a massive app because somebody reads them that way and then thinks that's the way it's supposed to be done.
Yeah, so and I think a piece of that too is like going back to the frameworks. Yeah, just the whole like MVC control. You've got controllers and you've got views and models. Okay, going to put all my business logic in a model and I'm going to show that on a view, and my controller is just going to connect the two. And then
it's just a pattern that you see examples with, and that's kind of the end of it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there are good examples of like good sample apps, but having said that, I think that having these simple ones that, like I said, I'm guilty of, I worry sometimes about how they get interpreted. But going originally back to the requirement stuff, I'm still with I think more in line with where you were talking about your first two roles, and I don't necessarily view that as a bad situation. If you know what I mean, when working on a given task and you have these requirements of what something needs to happen, it's really understanding how that fits into the larger scheme of what the software is and what you're actually trying to accomplish with it. I mean, it's just having better understanding, I think. Yeah. I think there is also this, I've had people really, I don't know what the word to use, be mad at what I'm about to say, which is, yes, we're problem solvers, I get that, and you want to understand the problem so that you can implement a really good solution. But what's to say that you are as knowledgeable about the very the very details of the problem itself that somebody else is giving you the solution for that you need to implement? You know what I mean? Like, there's been situations where I've been in where, like you were talking about, like in manufacturing, where the deep understanding that somebody had about the problem took me a couple of years to really gain that deep, and I still didn't have to what the person was educating me on about what the situation was, and it had a lot to do with the financials of manufacturing. But for me to be like 2 months in and being able to talk to somebody in that domain and come up with a solution that I would have came up with something, but I likely feel like in that situation, the solution coming out of the person with 30 years experience about the domain probably had a little bit more weight to it.
Yeah.
How I implement is a different story. I'm the only one that can do it. I'm the technical person. I get that. And I should understand as much as I can. But I think there's this correct me if I'm wrong, or maybe I'm just totally out off the left wing here, but I think there's a lot of developers that think that they need to come up with a solution, like the business solution. And it's like, well, I'm a problem solver. I should be fixing business solutions too. I think, yes, that'd be awesome. And you should be involved deeply into it. But don't discount anybody else from coming up with a solution.
Yeah, I think I would agree. I would agree with you I think there are edge cases. We won't go there. I would agree, and I'd add that I think it's important for us to probe. So as developers, I think it's important for us to say, okay, here's your solution, but what about this thing out here, and what about this thing out here? Like, what happens when we deal with this other thing, or this weird scenario, or whatever? I've seen that's the value that a lot of times I can bring is, here's what you've given me, and now I'm just going to think about how can I break this, or like.
And even if it's to get confirmation back that, yeah, you're right about this, and I never thought about that. Awesome. Or no, you're an idiot. That's the dumbest question I ever heard. But that not you're an idiot, but that's a dumb question. Dumb questions are awesome too, because then they start validating things that you think are an issue that aren't even an issue at all.
Yeah.
Right. It's gaining. It's kind of like when we talked to Adam. It's gaining your understanding. So yeah, I'm all for the collaboration. But I don't think it needs to be like the needle has to point one direction or the other totally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it depends on the company too. I mean, yeah, going back to those companies I worked for before, it's like, yeah, I mean, they, like you said, they had people who were like 30 years experience in the industry. It's like they know how it works, right?
Yeah,
they know what needs to be done.
There's always that argument too, which is they're maybe too close to it too to see sometimes.
Yeah, and I think that comes down to again being able to ask questions like, okay, well, as far as I understand it, here's the solution. Like, what if we tried it this way? Like, does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I think I mean it's like a halfway from what you were saying. Like we don't want to discount what they say, and we have to recognize they know the domain, but there is definitely an aspect that they could be too close to it.
Correct. Yeah.
But then I think our role is just okay. Let's think about it this way. Like, again, coming back to like boundaries, right? It's like, do we want to separate things by technical concerns or by other metrics, like rate of change of code, or whatever, right? Language, like ubiquitous language or whatever, however you want to do that. And then presenting those to them and being like, does this make sense? Like, if we do it, here's the scenarios. We'll take the same scenarios and test it against this new way of thinking about the model. Does that make sense to you? And
yeah, I think it's somewhere in between, right? Like it's not this, here's this stack of papers that say exactly how to implement something like that.
Yeah.
That to me doesn't work. And then the exact other side of like, here's nothing, developer. You figure it all out, and you have almost no knowledge potentially of the domain you're in. It's like, well, how naive is the solution you're going to come up with?
It's going to be probably.
Yeah, probably. So it's finding that collaboration in between, right? Like, I think it's just, I don't know. I feel like our industry is full of extremes. It's like everything we do is always like one side or the other, and just trying to find the balance.
Yeah, it's something driven development. Everything is something driven development. Yeah. And you can't be like, I'll take a little bit of that and I'll take a little bit of that, and that's a good idea. Let's use some of those principles. But so it's like you're all agile, or you're all TDD or DDD or whatever DD.
Yeah, or DD something.
Yep.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Loosely Coupled Show. If you did, please subscribe for more on software architecture and design.